Seam allowance is the distance between the edge of the fabric and the stitch line. It's the amount of fabric that you have to work with that stays on the inside of the garment. The more seam allowance you have, the more stable it is. When your seam is opened, like this, your seam allowance can be pressed open or pressed to one side. I like it pressed open. This seam has been finished on both sides with a zigzag. Again, seam allowance is the distance from the edge of the fabric to the stitch line. There are guidelines on your machine that indicate how far away from the needle your edge of fabric could be. Those are called seam allowance guidelines. Seam allowance guidelines on your machine. There are all of these little grooves that go on both the right side and the left side of your machine, and those little grooves are marked with measurements. So we start with 3/8 away from the needle, and they're all measured from where the needle is in the center of the presser foot. Some machines have a left justified needle, in which case when that happens, then they're measured from the needle when it's left justified. But for the Baby Lock Joy, and I believe the Baby Lock Zest, the needle is justified in the center, and those guidelines are measured out from the center. So we have 3/8, a half, 5/8, then this line indicates 6/8 or 3/4, and then we go to an inch, or 7/8, and then an inch. So we also have guidelines here along this plate where the bobbin that covers the bobbin, and how we line our fabric up to get on the seam allowance is to put it right here and make sure this edge is right along that guideline. So right now I have it on the 1/2 inch guideline here, and it's also on the 1/2 inch guideline right there. If I wanted on 5/8, I would lift this up, move it over to the 5/8 guideline, and you can see how it's running close to this guideline here and also here. So when you're sewing, you want to keep your eyeballs focused in this area to keep your seam allowance even.